Hello, welcome to the Viewpoint. I am Mamadou Mboj. The future of any society is determined by the quality of its children. That goes without saying. Yet, children across the country continue to be at risk of violence, harm, and abuse of all kinds. According to the World Bank, children in the Gambia achieve only 40% of their full potential. And in their 2018 Human Capital Index, the Gambia was ranked 130th out of 157 countries. Not a pretty picture. One of the bodies dedicated to the children's rights and the child protection services is the CPA, the Child Protection Alliance. And joining me here in the studio to talk about the Alliance's work is the country coordinator, Mr. Lamin Fati. Welcome to the Viewpoint.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. So let's start from the beginning. Alliance, how many different affiliates, members, whatever you want to call it, or at least the key players?
Well, thank you so much. Child Protection Alliance has been formed since 2001, and this happens at a time where Gambia as a country has been gone through the ratification of regional and international legal instruments, notably the United Nations Convention on the Right of the Child, which Gambia has ratified in 1990.
So CPA, is it a governmental agency or non-governmental?
It's a non-governmental.
Non-governmental
It's a non-governmental, yes. And also Gambia has ratified then the African Charter on the Right and Welfare of the Child in 2000. But also there was a need to kind of like see how best you are able to create a platform that will be able to discuss on issues of children, because basically it was quite something of a new dimension around the whole issues of child protection, because child protection was hardly even discussed at the national platform. So
whose idea was it to form it? Who formed it?
So stakeholders, UNICEF, through the initiative of UNICEF and the Department of Social Welfare, then thought it wise that they could able to come together and create such an alliance that would able to work together to make sure that at the end of the day, they help to complement government efforts as civil society members, so that they are able to reach out, because already this is a new concept all in all. If I said new concept, human rights has never been a new concept. It could only be a new concept around, coming with some basis of a legal aspect of a human right, especially around issues of children. So based on this, UNICEF and the SW then came together, and they were able to scout out to make sure that member organization who works within the different fields of child rights are able to form the alliance. So basically, CPA is more like a secretarial. Based on statistics we have, it's like since its formation in 2001, it has gotten its NGO status in 2007. But the information by then as membership, it was about 40 plus. But gradually down the line, currently we're looking at 36 different organizations who forms the core of the secretariat, the alliance rather. So basically CPA is more like a secretariat of member organization who works in different thematic areas when it comes to issues of child protection.
Yes, so you are the coordinator?
Yes, I'm the national coordinator.
So you coordinate all these, 36 you said, members?
Yes, because like the spirit of having to have a secretariat, and it was there purposely to have a kind of like a secretariat that would able to coordinate how all these organizations work when it comes to issues of child protection, and how also too we are able to form a synergy around as to how do we do so that we are able to address issues of children when it's and based on our individual and collective responsibility as institutions.
That's it. So now let's get to the nitty-gritty. What are some of the components you have of child protection, the child protection system, the components of the system?
Basically, when you talk about the child protection system, you have to look at the whole national child protection framework. You want to classify it into 3 elements. You want to talk about what is in the framework when it comes to issues of protection. What do you have in the framework when it comes to issues of giving response? What is in the framework when it comes to issues of giving the remedial response? So basically, because when you look at issues of human rights, it's more of issues of accountability. So it's not something that you think, well, is a common idea that anybody could just give an interpretation of what is human right or child rights. Because the belief I have, issues of child rights, issues of human rights become an issue of accountability. Someone must be held into account. But also too, you have the question of, but on what? So you will see then you have to place as to the commitment in which a particular entity or an individual happens to take to say, well, this is my commitment that I will be able to do X, Y, and Z on behalf of certain individuals. But in the part of human rights, we're talking about...
So in this instance, we're talking about accountability.
Yes.
Is it a legal accountability, a moral one? What sort of accountability?
Well, with rights, you talked about issues of, when we speak, you know, I talked about the issue of having the state to ratify regional and international legal instruments. Basically, we talked about the issue of, well, legal accountability as far as those legal frameworks are concerned. So if a state, for example, ratify a treaty legal instrument, it's taken 3 commitments. It has taken a commitment to protect, it's taken commitment to fulfill, and taken commitment to respect the fundamental rights as inscribed in both, whether it's a regional or international legal instrument.
But if it doesn't apply it, if I have that right and the state doesn't give it to me, can I take it to court?
Yeah, this is where I was talking about the element of accountability, because where each and every individual derives its reference point towards take into account is the laws we have. Obviously, you have a whole constitution of the Gambia of 1997, which is a comprehensive legal instrument and the supreme legal instrument for the matter. But also, when you have the issues of children, you have the Children Act 2005 amended in 2016, which has drawn its inspiration from the ratification of these 2 legal instruments. So basically, rights are in 2 aspects. The state has the primary responsibility and obligation to make sure that those rights are being protected. But also you have what we call the duty, the right holder, who has the right to also demand that if the state has taken a commitment that I should be able to attend school without free education, for example, the state has taken that commitment. So for me, it's for me to say, okay, I'm demanding that the state must be able to provide. And where the state fails, this is where you can say,
this is my point.
A state as an entity, a state is an entity that could sue and that could also be sued. And where the state fails in fulfilling its commitment in terms of providing, whether in terms of protection, whether in terms of services, you know, anybody could take the state to say, well, the state has failed in its commitment as per the provision. You can quote provisions from the source, like whether it's the Constitution, whether it's the Children Act.
That is certainly true, but as you can see, I think in the Education Act, that free education bit, there was a clause there where you really cannot sue the state if he doesn't give you fulfill that right. But more generally here, the legal framework, you've talked about the 2005 Act, as amended in 2016. Do you think that it's adequate as it is right now? What's the problem with the legal framework in your eyes?
Well, basically, when you look at our legal framework within the country, it's not only limited to the Children Act, even though the Children Act 2005 is the most comprehensive legal instrument when it comes to the issue of protecting the welfare of children. But also, too, we have some couple of some acts, legal instruments. We talk about the Sex Tourism Offence Act. We talked about the Labor Act. We talked about the Trafficking in Person Act. So we have a lot of acts within the place. But also, too, you realize as to looking at those laws and those national policies and strategies we have, you will realize that, well, to a greater percentage, Gambia is able to have sufficient laws and policies that could adequately protect the welfare of children. I know when you talked about the alignment of our domestic law, which is the Children Act, compared to the regional and international legal instrument, you realize that, yes, we have done so far. We have done a great work around making sure that we are able to meet regional and international standards. So far, so good. I think one of the advocacy even point that we're trying to see that in terms of alignment is the issue of corporal punishment, which we think that is not in line with, for example, you go to the UNCRC, Article 19, talks about you know, where the state must able to do anything, everything appropriate, and I mean, to take any appropriate measures in terms of education, administrative, whatever, to make sure that children are protected from any form of physical or mental abuses. So, and which obviously, I know in 2004, we have the general recommendation number 6 that came from the Committee of Experts on the right of the child, where they hold on the state government to say there is no ambiguity, right? There's no ambiguity in Article 19 in court that children must be able to be protected from all forms of physical and mental. So, and corporal punishment obviously it falls under that part violation of the child right. Even though, yes, you will argue that at the level of the country we have an education ministerial directive from the education that haphazardly, you have 15A that talks about total prohibition of corporal punishment, but you have the 15B that talks about corporal punishment could be applicable through by the headmaster or by the supervision of the headmaster, and it's supposed to be locked in a logbook. So basically, that means you at a certain point Gambia is giving and legalizing corporal punishment. So, but that is also in contradiction.
But you see, this is it. I mean, corporal punishment is so embedded. Yes. All of us, we were beat when we were at school. Even at home, your parents, your uncles, your aunts, people beat you up. Yes. This is what we do. We beat up our children. This is what happens. But how would you respond to this criticism? Yes, we've got all of these laws, but some researchers have sort of suggested that when you put in these alien laws, which are really adaptations of British models or French models of how to for children's welfare, when you want to impose it in a society where the norms, the fundamental practices and norms are different, then in all likelihood you wouldn't see the outcomes you want. They are unlikely to enforce these laws because society isn't like that.
Yeah, I think also too this has to boil down to our understanding as to what do we perceive as rights, as what do we perceive as child rights. For me, I'm a strong believer that, you know, every human right is nothing but other than what God has given to each and every one of us.
But this is very interesting. You should say that, because here the argument is that people deal with children's welfare in the context of families and communities, not individual people's rights. You know what I mean? That individualism, as it were, seems to be divorced from our norms. So it becomes a problem. You have two norms, as it were, sitting uneasily. That is why perhaps we've not been seeing the outcomes that we want to see because of these incongruities.
No, because when you look at the whole thing, that's why the narration needs to be clear.
All right.
That, you know, the first international legal instrument, any regional or international legal instrument that came into existence was the United Nations Convention on the Right of the Child. That at one point, you know, when it came into existence in 1989, there were some votes from African countries, because by then, African countries, their representation was about 3 or 4 countries. So because, Africans who are part of the United Nations, almost all of them are part of the United Nations, really appraise the fact that, well, you know, this is something that they quite welcome. But, you know, they came up with the but, you know, within the context of having to recognize child rights or whatever child rights within the context of Africa is totally different from the context of the developed world. So as a result of that, Africans were able to come out with the African Charter on the right and welfare of the child, which actually was able to come up with an inclusion of African culture, norms and values.
For example, our parents.
Yeah, for example, when you look at the distinction between the United Nations Convention on the Right of the Child and that of the African Charter, and even within our Children Act 2005, you wouldn't see anywhere specific provisions within the UNCRC that talk about the responsibility of a child. But yet, when you look at the Children Act, for example, you go to section 23 of the Children Act, it talks about what? The responsibility of a child. And it's clearly stipulated, you know, that children must able to, not only limited to parents, must able to respect parents, elders, you know, and children must able to work towards using their skills and knowledge towards the development process of the country. To the extent that it has made an emphasis that children must not able, as they grow up, going out even within the international platform, they must be able to carry forth the norms and values of the Gambia.
So here you mean the responsibility of the child is to be obedient?
Yeah, even though analysis experts will able to look critic that if you're talking about obedience in what context, because we have the fundamental right to where, for example, we talked about the child has a right to form opinion and express opinion. So would that be even a limitation? Because if you ask a child to say, oh, anything your parents said, you must be obedient, you must be able to obey them. So that provision is kind of like a massage a bit. So for us, we said no, but if you're talking about the participation of a child, even though there's a provision also, there's, I mean, kind of like a classification that where a child could able to participate meaningfully has to be based on the understanding and the maturity of that particular person. So having to say, you know, you have to obey anything your parents say or elderly person says, that compromises the participation level. So for us, we want to say, yes, issues affecting children, not every other issue, but issues affecting children, their well-being and their welfare, they must able to, you know, parents must able to propose. Children also put their view on the table, and they are able to come to compromise. But also to, let me make this very clear, there is no provision in the whole Children Act or the UNCRC that has given children absolute right without reasonable supervision by the parents.
Yes, I mean, when doubts whether absolute rights can ever exist, rights are only relative.
Exactly.
for everybody to enjoy them. So, but this is it. So now you have the rights on the one side, and as you sort of acknowledged it, we have the norms, we have certain norms, as it were,
yes,
on the other side, but we know that with us, it's really the family, the community that is really in charge of children. It seems some people will say that with the state, there's really no overarching strategy of what kind of a relationship the state should have with children and families, as it were. So it seems that you think that we are mixing two ways of seeing. I think that is why perhaps your job is quite difficult in seeing to children having their rights and their services they deserve.
Basically, if you have an in-depth understanding of these laws, how they operate, you realize that there is nothing of contradiction as to how our society, the community works within when it comes to social protection. Because there is, I think, the only thing every law does, and I think I've said that rights are of divine will. God has given each and every one of us these rights. So what the laws have done is to make sure that, you know, these laws have been codified. That as much as you giving rights to these children, you must able to make sure that you don't do things that expose them to abuses and exploitation.
But you know very well that to say something like rights are divine will, it's an abstraction. Either you accept it or you don't. Yes. It is not a self-evident fact. I mean, from you know, if you're from the U.S. tradition, you can take that. But if you're from maybe China, they will say something entirely different. So it depends. This is like a Western narrative.
No, basically, I bet too. Because even when
that is why they're trampled on all over the place. No, rights are always trampled on.
No, because when you look at some of these basic rights that we're talking about, for example, we have the Children Act, which is a comprehensive legal instrument, and it's been divided into 18 parts. You have part 2 that talks about the rights from 6 to 23. That is telling you, these are basic things that you will agree, that the child has right to a name. The child must be able to have a right to nationality, health care, parental responsibility towards the child, as well as the child has a responsibility to the parents. But equally, we talked about the element of participation. You know, I've remember instances where I will engage religious leaders. I remember of 2 instances. You know, before I start my presentation, the first question that was posed to me was like, oh, Mr. Fadi, you people always talk about the issues of child rights. What is the origin of child rights? You know, and the best way you could give is to say, okay, now let's go back and define child rights within the context of our religion. So you realize that all this that we're talking about, you know, is nothing new. You go to the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, the first article talks about what? That we are all born equal with this right, without any discrimination.
But this is exactly the point. Parents have always had, I would like to think, it's almost instinctive, I think, that responsibility for their children.
Yes.
That bit has always been, I suspect, with human beings.
Yes.
Perhaps the notion of rights is the codification.
Yes.
Codifying it, and then the state will come and either punish you and stuff like that. Maybe that is the iffy bit. In fact, if there's any argument, that is the iffy bit. But the responsibility of parents and their kids, that is as old as man. It is the codification of how that responsibility should be. That domain should be for the parents, the community. The state, one is not quite sure.
No, but
maybe people don't think like that in these parts.
Yeah, but when you look at the issues of child rearing, whether we are all either Christian or you are a Muslim, you know, both the Bible and the Quran has given a comprehensive way of how we must able to do a child rearing, which is obviously, that is not placing any responsibility on any other person other than the parents. And there is nothing where you go and said, you know, you as the parents, you must be able to subject your child to issues that would fundamentally harm the child in the nearest future. But because of also too, you know, we transform, the world evolved around things. We've realized that if things happen, women and children become the most vulnerable. But because you're looking at them as a special individual, I mean, specific individual that are so vulnerable to such situation, they are powerless and they're dependent on people. And obviously, history will tell you that most of the things when they happen, because the children are so dependent on the adult population, what happens? Their rights are trampled on. We have seen where children, for example, the issues of rape, that is not part of child rearing. That is violation of the fundamental right of that particular person. Subjecting a child to harmful, hazardous labor, that at the end of the day, it compromises with the health and well-being of the person. So you don't want to have a society where you don't have the regulations. You don't have the laws to say because at the home level, obviously the parents become the primary duty bearer to make sure that the welfare of the particular person is taken care of. So you're looking at even these laws, you realize that the way these laws have been, they said, well, this is the right of a particular child, but the responsibility lies on the parents. Where the parents cannot afford it, is the state responsibility to make sure that parents are supported. So I think the element, yes, I will agree that, yes, people think that children are something that we own. They are objects that we own that are owned by parents. So as a result of that, they think that...
And the community.
And the community.
Essentially.
I remember of an instance of when I was passing, a child was beating the siblings. So I stopped and said, don't beat the person. And you know what he said to me? She said to me, oh, you're a garausa. You know, my own brother, you're asking me not to. But I think to a certain degree...
The social norms. This is really what I was talking about, the norms versus the code.
And I think also too, this is where we need to make a further distinction, because when you look at rights, it's classified into three. They will tell you the natural rights which have been codified to give the legal mandate, but nonetheless you have what we call the moral rights. And I think in terms of moral, this is not static, it's not uniform globally. It's from one region, one country to another. That is where we talked about our cultural norms and values.
Well, that's it. But that is the problem with when you talk about moral rights, then who enforces? That is about how society sanctions people who go against the norm. That is where you'll get the sanction. But the morality bit is a bit funny, because with me, I learned my definition of what it means to have a right from, you know, the philosopher Jeremy Bentham. If I cannot enforce it in the courts, it's not a right. That is an interesting definition, which I think is a practical definition for me, which I like.
So that's it. So those rights, that's why it's been codified to say you need to do that, because it becomes legal, because it is enforceable in the laws. That's why we talk about issue of...
That's why the moral rights bit is very difficult.
But no, the moral element is a stand-alone.
Yes.
Now, the moral rights is not something that is enforceable by the law. You can't go to court. Absolutely. You can't go to any police officer to say, law enforcement officers, in terms of morality, you could be able to take this, even though you might have some certain restriction on certain element that the law would say do not. For example, indecent act, maybe you, in terms of the norms and values, they will tell you, well, for example, the hot topic of the day, at the end of the day, we talk about the LGBTs. to us, when you look at the element of rights, legal right is telling you these are people that could form a union with whoever they wish without making the discrimination against their sexual orientation. But you're looking at the norms and values here. For example, our cultures would not actually permit that to happen.
So this is the key.
You understand? So at one point you realize, yes, if a protection is happening here, but this is the norms and values that we're trying to protect. Sometimes too, it's even embedded within our cultural, religious belief to say, if you do this, the law is protected, but this we will not accept. So you have some element of resistance as to not happen. So we understand all these things. But at the end of the day, I think what is more important is that child right is nothing more, nothing less other than trying to create a conducive environment where this child is free from anything that will end up, having the child, or compromises the child from realizing his or her potential in the near future. And every parent, obviously, will be able to understand that, well, we must be able to appreciate this aspiration as when the law is in place to make sure that children are.
Absolutely. So this brings us to my next point. So what are some of your strategies as a Child Protection Alliance to address some of these issues regarding children?
Yeah, because as we have a civil society, we are an NGO sector. So we have about two fundamental roles that we play. You have the role of a complementary role, where we think we should be able to work with the state, with relevant stakeholders, with community and parents, to make sure that issues of children are understood to a certain degree. So that because it's about knowledge, how do you make sure that knowledge has increased, but also to what is more important is about behavioral change based on some of the issues that we have just discussed. So basically, in terms of complementing government roles, responsibility, we do a lot of, we have our strategy, for example, a part of our strategy is to make sure that at the level of the community, what structures do you put in place? What strategies are you going to put in within the communities to make sure that these issues are not looked at as something that is so foreign, looked at as Eurocentric ideas or philosophies that has been imposed on you, but it's about community taking understanding, taking ownership around issues of child protection. So as a result of that, we have instituted what we call the community child protection committees. These are community-based structures that you have volunteers, about 15 to 20 members who are within the communities, and we kind of obviously will do capacity building for them to make sure that at the end of the day they are able to understand the issues of our child rights, what are child right protection, what are the mechanisms, what are some of the things that you need to do in order to observe. But what is also important, because...
But this is quite interesting here. You said you haven't imposed anything, yeah? But yet you've created this child protection committees.
Yes.
So that was your own creation. Maybe the idea is, in any community you go, really, they have their own conflict resolution mechanisms.
Yes.
Very informal.
Yes.
Perhaps the idea is that for you to tap into that, because that's how they take care of everything, all kinds of conflict with children, grown-ups and children, between children, that's how they take care of it. Without tapping into that, your committees will not really deliver the outcomes that you want.
You'll be surprised that I think also in building some of these community structures, it's not just out of an isolation. That has been quite consultational. And as I said, because there has not been that platform within communities that specifically deal with issues of children. I know, most of you just said that maybe when you were young, you were beaten and all stuff. Those were the notions, those were the beliefs. But
don't you think they're still widespread?
Well, I know of the regions in which we intervene. We have seen some great improvement when it comes to issues of even understanding how children should be handled, and when also I know we are always chilling with the fact that, well, we used to have what we call the culture of silence. When some of these things happens, they happen within communities, but they were never reported. And most of the time we've realized that children were more subject to victimization against protecting the perpetrators, because families don't see some of these things as a child abuse as something that will have a negative impact on the life and welfare of the child. So basically, as some of the strategies, now you are able to put a mechanism. The mechanism actually, they identify who is going to be part of that. And all that we do is to make sure that it becomes a robust mechanism within the communities. You create what we call a case management system, kind of, when it happens. Because of now, you're not dealing with issues. Let me make this clear as well too. Issues of human-to-human relations. You have what we call criminal as far as the law is concerned, but you have what we also call as what civil matters. Sometimes when there's a conflict within the community, they have their own conflict resolution that they could able to stay on and work and make sure that they are able to address it. But also to where you have an existence of a legal framework is telling you criminal matters are not something that could be negotiated within the communities.
Then you see, most people then wouldn't really cooperate with some of your committees. That is why, and you call it the culture of silence, these social norms really will predominate in their thinking over your so-called rights, which perhaps they do not even quite understand. We are more embedded in our traditions than with these sort of post-colonial.
I think I might not be too subjective to that to make sure that they are not accepting that, because I've actually interacted with communities.
Okay.
And from research being conducted over the years, we've seen some drastic improvement in terms of community appreciation when it comes to handling the issues of children, particularly when it comes to protecting their fundamental rights. So for me, I think there is a whole change of how people perceive. I know also too, you will realize that at one point too, I think for me is how information is being delivered within the community level. Because sometimes the way we deliver some of this information is not giving them any option. It's about this is what the law says and this is what you must be able to do. And at the moment that approach is not proper, because community will take it as they're too impulsive. But I think the strategies are now, this is a child, these are the issues. You encourage communities to come with their grassroots initiative to see what do they do, how do they make sure that they are able to create that conducive environment within communities. I know it's difficult because you have what we call the core values in terms of our norms and culture. We talk about the issues of the FGMC, female genital mutilation, because this is not only a health issue, it's a human right issue. Having to expose a child to genital mutilation or cutting is a violation. But you realize also too, it's a great challenge because we think it's part of our cultural norms and values, a core for that matter, to the extent that sometimes it's blended with religious beliefs. So you find that very difficult to do away with it, because this is what normal statistics will indicate that even though there was a law instituted in 2015 up to date, instead of the practice being drastically reducing, it's still on the sky, still skyrocketing. So basically that tells you still now communities must able to, they don't easily give up some of these norms and values. But also to...
but that is really precisely what the problem is. Societal norms.
Yes.
So whatever laws that you're going to create, you must perhaps make sure that it emerges, as it were, from the society in many ways. Otherwise, there will be a problem of enforcement. Hence the problem the CPA and all people working in the field of child protection are having so many difficulties with certain societies, to enforce certain standards, which are often, as some people say, international donor trends.
No, I think, well, for me, I am of a person who most of the time, if I speak around issues of children at the community level, I feel that the law should not be something that I should elaborate more on, because laws are just deterrent to make sure people don't do this. What is more important is to concentrate on why this law is to get the negative consequences out, so that people understand that if this happens, if you do this, this will be the outcome. Mind me, you're dealing with greater percentage of parents who have actually never been to the four corners of the classroom. So, in terms of getting to know some of these studies, surveys that have been conducted to relate our cultural practices in relation to, the well-being of that particular child, what is the impact? That's why for me, it's like all the time, talk about the impact. Even though do not forget to talk about, well, if you don't think that you can do this, because you have people who are so adamant that no matter come rain, come shine, the laws are there, they will still continue doing their practices. So for me, I think, yes, the law will have to be there. You go to the Children Act, Article 19, talks about that any kind of like traditional or cultural practices that are harmful to the well-being of the particular child or children must be discouraged. So I think we need to make a distinction. We are not, there is no law that tells you outright there is a outright condemnation of, you know, the cultural norms and values. But we feel like adopt the best good ones, do away with the ones that you think that obviously they will have some health negative consequences on children.
Absolutely. I was recently, there was a research done by some researchers studying Cote d'Ivoire, about 6 countries, Ghana, and that sort of thing. And they realized that the child protection systems that they've instituted, variations of perhaps the British model or the French model, they realized that the outcomes that they wanted to get, really, they couldn't see the outcomes because there appears to be a disconnect. They didn't tap into the local ways of doing things, into the local mechanisms, but rather came in with their own structures, you know, driven by all sorts of interest. So therefore, you never see the outcome. So perhaps one is trying to get to a point where the CPA and people who work with children, given the complexities, try to be more creative, tap more into the local resources in dealing with certain things. Perhaps that's when one can see the outcomes. Otherwise, children will continue to suffer. We are not seeing the outcomes that we were supposed to see.
No, I think, when I looked at some of these things, I looked at the law, the policies, but I also feel like only the enforcement of the laws wouldn't make it happen, wouldn't make the desired outcome that we also desire. I remember one of your programs, I heard you were emphasizing on the losses in terms of enforcement of laws. As a result of that, children are left, you know, exposed to all factors that could expose them to some vulnerability or risk. But also too, as I said, when you look at the element of rights, the state has the primary responsibility as a stateholder, as a state. But also too, it's not only about making laws. It's about, when you look at the laws, how do you make sure that at the end of the day, those that you are protecting becomes vulnerable, where they exist. For example, you go to section 76 of the Children Act, that's talk about children who need special protection and care. You know, you have a whole list of categories that the state should be able to identify them as vulnerable people, but not only identifying them, the state must be able to provide family strengthening support so that those children who lack the basic needs within their homes or parents could not afford, the state should have provided that. So the laws alone would not provide the change unless and until you are able to address the underlying cause of all these things happening to children. And most of the time it's about poverty. Parents don't have the means to make sure that at the end of the day they are able to provide the basic needs of children. You and I, we live in a comfort zone where we can walk to a healthcare facility and pay over 1,000 just at one stand. But you know, you're looking at the health part of it, you tell a woman to say by and force provide the health facility for basic needs in terms of health, when that woman cannot provide $100. So which means, but if you created that element of, this is the facility, government has created this facility, you as a parent, you have an obligation to make sure that this child is able to make use of these facilities at his or her disposal. They will be obviously able to take it. We talked about the issue of child marriage, for example. Most of when you talk to parents, their fear is what? That if care is not taken, they will not their children will definitely get impregnated outside. So for them, it's not, the law says this, but they're talking about family prestige, family integrity. Before my child gets pregnant, I suppose the child needs to go out for marriage. But the state must be able to come up with mechanism to make sure that at the end of the day, those children that we're trying to make sure that they are not exposed to child marriage, they are able to have a whole comprehensive an effective child protection system that would see that they transit from their education to whatever they are, what level, without being exposed to all these devices. So I know it's quite complex, and you know,
absolutely. And perhaps some people might say that with certain social issues, you're likelier to get the outcome you want by persuasion rather than coercion. Where a society doesn't want something, for the state to impose that, to enforce that, I mean, it often takes a lot, particularly in a democratic politics. In dictatorships, don't worry about it. They take care of people like that. But under democratic politics, it becomes extremely, extremely difficult. So people who work in this area must realize the limited space they've got to maneuver in many ways. What do you think?
I think the problem is not when the laws are formed. The problem is well before having to enactment of these laws. Mind me, if you talked about having the UNCRC is never used in the Gambia as a law. The African Charter is never used in the Gambia as our domestic law. And you know, during the process of having to sign, you go and review those the provisions before you do a reservation on that, whether general or specific. You know, you look at this regional or international legal framework to say, well, when you look at all these provisions, there are provisions that are not in line with our cultural norms and values. And this is the time the state should have taken the step to say, well, we could sign all this, we can ratify all this particular provision, but X, Y, and Z provision could not be ratified based on the norms and values. But unfortunately, this is Gambia has never had any reservation, specific reservation to any of this. They were all ratified in full. And if that happens, what is that telling you? Every provision in those ones should be translated to domestic laws. And for people like, for organizations like CPA, Child Protection Alliance, when we speak, we don't only speak as what we think is right. We speak on the premises of this, what is happening in terms of legal framework, national level, what is happening at the regional and international level. So when we speak, it's about what the commitments are, what the government states. So that's why most of the time, as I talked about the element of accountability, that when parents fail to do X, Y, and Z, most of the time you will hear us, we said government fails to put laws or to enforce the laws because government has taken the commitment. So for me, I think there should have been a whole citizen engagement when this law was coming into being. I always tell people, one of the best approach I love about building the constitution is the 2000, the draft constitution that is on the common. We have seen citizen participation, and they will be able to be in a position to tell you how do we align our laws as to how we want to be governed.
Absolutely, but we also, what happened to the National Assembly? To this point, what would you say are the sort of the key achievements of the CPA so far? Given the situation on the ground, what have been your achievements?
Well, in terms of complementing government efforts, we were able to, with partners and other international and donor partners, we were able to create some level of understanding when it comes to people, the general public understanding, issues around child rights. Because this
but when you look at the statistics, the picture is not pretty. We talk about child sex tourism. Even recently, the penny appeal, wasn't it? The penny appeal case was discontinued. I mean, when you look at the situation, it doesn't look pretty at all, to be quite honest.
No, I quite agree with you to the fact that, well, for me, when you look at the whole framework, legal framework that we have in terms of policies and everything that we need to do as a country, and you look at actually what is happening on the ground, you realize that, no, absolutely in terms of translating those well-intended laws and policies has never translated to address the realities on the ground. You know, I've talked about the issue of you having the laws, but also you want to see the commitment from government, not in terms of putting laws, but in terms of resources. What is the investment level that you can look at the national budget and proudly talked about your government is investing around the issue of children. Government is investing around less than 2%. of the national budget towards addressing issues of children. So basically, issues of child rights is quite an expensive one, quite complex. And government must be able to invest properly to make sure that those mechanisms that we have are operational. For example, you look at our structures. It's not in terms of law policies, but you have some mechanism in place. Every police station you go, there is within the police force, you have specific unit for gender and child welfare. You have special, security agencies.
How effective have they been? This is
because they would not.
How many have been investigated? How many taken to court? When you look at these statistics, it doesn't tell you.
Not to be quite honest, I am one of the critics of government when it comes to government living to its expectations. You having all those structures in place, yet you can talk about the number of rape cases you can report on, but you can never proudly talk about the number of successful prosecution that you have done. We have seen cases at one point been given one time of a media publicity, the next minute the cases die out. So which means the state needs to do more in terms of law enforcement, in terms of investment. And sometimes too, I think it's about how do we create further accountability within individuals that work for the state. I've had issues where we talked about there has been a lot of extortion from perpetrators to make sure the cases have been compromised. So you report a case, the next minute is off the hook. I know with that of the penny appeal, I wouldn't want to elaborate on that, but it's under investigation. But to be quite honest, I don't think. Well,
we saw in the papers here.
Yeah, but it is not. I think the basis of having it from the courts is that I think the wrong people were obviously charged. When I also looked at, when I first looked at.
What did you make of that?
No, because actually.
Because one would have thought that investigations were done and, everything would be tidy before you dare go to court to charge. One would have thought that. It's simply commonsensical. So, honestly, what did you make of that when it was afterwards asserted that the wrong people it was a case of mistaken identity?
No, I think I think the police did a very bad work around that. I've partially looked at the report of the police and the recommendations that were there. And also you have another committee, which I was part of through the Department of Social Welfare, where you realize that the findings and recommendations that we have had never reflected on the legal opinion from the AG chambers.
So this is it. We see so many of these gaps. Then, as a body, you couldn't have achieved very much, really.
Yeah, I remember discussing with someone. I said, the way I've seen this case, why it wouldn't come out as to our expectation. Because at one point, I remember calling the attention. I think we even wrote to the AG chambers to say, we would ask you to hold on this case because what the opinion is expressing is not actually our recommendation, and obviously it's not within the recommendation that we have seen within the police. So basically, I think there was a need. Otherwise, we would have gone to, the state would have gone to actually having individual as scapegoat against something that they have not committed. So for me, I wouldn't comment more on that, but I think what is now our role is to make sure that the state must able to go back to make sure the police investigate this matter and that this matter is not being compromised.
That's it. So with you, the CPA, when you look at the situation, how it is, what realistically do you think that you can contribute? What realistically do you think that you can achieve? Because as you've said earlier, you said many things really depends on the government, depends on the state. So you as a body, what realistically can you achieve given all these constraints?
There is what we call you cannot abrogate your rights. The state cannot abrogate its responsibility to civil society organizations. Civil society organizations are not the state. What we do is to make sure that where the state is not forthcoming, we are able to work with the state to make sure that they are able to do X, Y, and Z. But what is important is at the end of the day, because accountability in terms of enforcement and implementation is very key. Because CPA will able to, for example, the element, you have the whole pool of expertise when it comes to looking at the legal framework, CPA has been participating or has been advocating to make sure that, you know, there are specific things that needs to be in place. For example, we have the establishment of the Ministry of Gender, Women and Social Welfare through advocacy efforts. We are able to make sure that at the end of the day, the Gambia is able to have laws to ban FGMC, to ban child marriage. The Gambia is able to come up with a lot of acts to make sure that, you know, at the end of the day, Gambia, in terms of legislation, we are able to align our legal framework within national or international, regional or international framework. So, but also too, we have limitation. We are not the state. We could not build schools. We could not, you know, we could not provide certain things that we think that is not within our means. Because what we see, CPA, or what we do is about how do we also work with international partners to make sure at the end of the day, when there are issues that we think is of eminent importance, so that we are able to invest on. We said, okay, for example, you have an issue of corporal punishment. You want to put resources. As government is not forthcoming in terms of law enforcement, but it's important that you are able to engage the community. You are able to engage the stakeholders so that they are able to understand the negative consequences around some of those things. But, and I think, to be quite honest, we've been also, data is something in this country that is quite lacking. You can't go anywhere in the country, anywhere that you will be able to have a comprehensive data around children and disaggregated data in terms of issues affecting children. You can't have that.
Do you collect your own data?
Yes, in 2014, the last survey we conducted was 2014. That was looking at issues of child marriage, FGMC, and corporal punishment. Currently, we have sanctioned a baseline study that is looking at, you know, child right in business principles, that is trying to see what are some of the underlying factors that promote the element of child sex tourism in the Gambia, because we all know at the international level, Gambia has been classified as paradise for child sex tourism. So we're now trying to work on to see what are the issues so that you're able to have a baseline and then able to work on strategies to make sure that at the end of the day, you are able to work with the state in addressing some of these issues. So in a nutshell, actually, what we could do is to work with government, but also we can able to scale up our accountability engagement at the regional or international level. So CPA also writes what we call the shadow report, because as part of the commitment that a state would take is the moment you ratify, you are supposed to be sending your first 2 years of ratification. You have to send an initial report. But after that, every 5 years, you have to send a report to indicate how far you have gone in fulfilling your commitment. So CPA has been actually forthcoming with what we call the shadow complementary report that comes from the civil society to either contradict or to put a fair picture as what is really happening in the country, different from what the state has presented.
Yes, because if you, without that sort of feedback survey, you really cannot measure the impact that your interventions are really having around.
Sure.
So now, moving forward, what is the way forward when you look at these formidable challenges that you're facing? Either you have a state that is dragging its feet, or perhaps the laws are not there, or you have these norms that are not really helpful. When you look at the field, facing all these formidable opponents, how would you strategize? What is your strategy to deal with this?
You know, I will propose, I think there's a high need that we have to go back to the drawing board. You know, review.
It has not been working.
Yes. And looking at it, I think there's a high time that we are able to do a proper revision of the policies, of the laws that we have. The Children Act, actually there are even, efforts to make sure that the Children Act is being reviewed to put within the context of the current realities. But also too, you have a whole child protection strategy that has expired. We had one from 2016 to 2020 that has expired since last year. So we need to go back to the drawing board. And I think over the years, one thing that has been hampering our effort is the issue of coordination. You know, there has been a lot of fragmentation in
the service delivery. In
the service delivery, in how do we work together. You know, it feels like there has been an element of competitive environment where each and every organization wants to be seen doing so. And also too, because you have this struggling over, everybody wants to struggle over the scarce resources within the international. So there has been a lot of that competition. So I think there's a need that we are able to have a national roadmap that will able to look at where do we want to take this country. When I looked at the Africa agenda of
the 2040.
The 2040.
Yes.
You look at the 10 aspirations, and you realize that if I was going to tick the boxes, Gambia would fall below standard in all the thematic 9 thematic area. I know it's 10, but when you look at the other 9 that deals with how we do our laws, birth registration, and so you realize that we are really underperforming. So for me, it's about transposing those issues and to come up with a national roadmap that will holistically look at, and government must be the key player here. Government must be able to know what organizations do in terms of X, Y, and Z. Because if you leave the free of the civil society organization not coordinated, sometimes, you know, civil society organization, we want to hold government into account. But what other accountability mechanisms are in place to hold civil society organization to account, to make sure that at the end of the day, the resources that we implement in our activities, not us, is on behalf of those particular children. But the state must be able to know if you are doing training on X, Y, and Z, how are you able to also work to make sure that you align your operation, your strategy in line with the national framework.
Thank you very much. Wonderful place to end it. Thank you, Mr. Lamin Fati. And thank you very much, viewers. We should take our children seriously and give them the dignity they deserve. They are our future. Until next time, I'm Mamadou Mbouch. Goodbye.